Good afternoon. It's Friday, the 6th of July 2018, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. Your host today, Mike Robinson, myself, Brian Gerrish, and we're delighted to have Alex Thompson back with us. Today we need him for some in-depth analysis. But of course, let's remind everybody to take care because it's, I believe, an orange warning for heat. We've never had proper sunshine in UK for several 100,000 years, apparently. So do take care. If in doubt, run, hide and tell.
Well, it's an orange alert for heat, but not for Novichok because apparently everything's fine with that, but we'll come on to that in a second. I wanted to begin just with one of the more hysterical articles in the mainstream press. I mean, we could have provided 20 or 30 articles blaming Russia, blaming everybody, but this was fantastic. Headline: Why not Novichok could be Russia's most terrifying weapon in a war with the West. And I just want to say thanks to everybody that sent this one in to us because we had seen it, but clearly everybody else was noticing it as well. This is by Hamish de Breton-Gordon, and he says the devastating Salisbury nerve agent. Actually, I won't tell you what he says just about that one just yet. He went on to say it was, he said, of high purity and persistence and would not be affected by weather conditions, confirming the British view that this was a military-grade nerve agent called Novichok. He was going back to what was going on with the Skripals, which is only made, he says, at a secret and closed military town, Shikany in central Russia. Now, that's not quite the story that other people were saying, but that seems to be the story that he's sticking with. And of course, in recent weeks, we had articles from the Express and others about how the Russians had been knocking down the facility at Shikany in recent months. And that was evidence that they were guilty for everything that's going on at the moment. But let's get back to that original quote, because this was kind of the sub-headlining, headline just below the image from Hamish de Breton-Gordon. It is spectacular. The devastating Salisbury nerve agent could be put in missiles or even hand grenades, Brian. So there you go. I think the UK column is about to produce a line of hand grenades on the UK column shop, which will have the brand name Novichok on them. If we're allowed to, we have to ask the Russians if we're allowed to do that. But that's that. You know, this is just getting insane.
Well, it's a shame we didn't have this chap around during the Cold War because he could have advised. He could have advised us of this. Not that we didn't know at the time it was perfectly possible to have gas shells and chemical agents in shells. We were all in that game, so it doesn't matter whether it was Russia, it was also USA, it was also UK playing around with the technology to gas people. But it's good to see that Mr. Hamish de Breton-Gordon has considered this could be used as a weapon. Tremendous analysis.
If somebody does throw a hand grenade at you, Brian, are you more likely to be concerned about being blown into little bits or poisoning from Novichok?
I think if you're throwing hand grenades, you'd want something that explodes. But I'm sure he's an extremely well-informed man. But I'm going to smile and laugh at his analysis at the same time because to me it's crass.
Alex, is he an extremely well-informed man?
His academic track record wouldn't suggest that, Mike. I'm going to sound awfully snobbish now as a major public school in Oxbridge man, but he went to Tonbridge School and then he did the well-known Tim Nice but Dim Joke degree, or Hooray Henry Joke degree of agricultural management at the University of Reading. And now he's off at the University of Bournemouth, another questionable institution, lecturing in disaster management. So he's not studied in any recognised academic fields.
Okay, good. That makes him pretty reliable, I suppose, as far as the government's concerned. But look, we were talking about the advice from Public Health England yesterday. That advice has now been followed up by a statement from Dame Sally Davies, who's the Chief Medical Officer. And she said 2 patients are in critical condition following exposure to the nerve agent Novichok. Following events in March, we have a well-established response to this type of incident and a clear process is to follow. Our priority at this time is to understand the circumstances surrounding how these 2 individuals became unwell and to ensure there's no further risk to the public's health from this incident. As the country's chief medical officer, I want to reassure the public that the risk to the general public remains low. I understand that those in Salisbury and its surrounding areas will be concerned at this news, particularly those who have recently visited the area, now cordoned off by the police. My advice for any individual that may be in any of the areas now cordoned off from 10 p.m. on Friday evening onwards is highly precautionary. As before, wash your clothes and wipe down any personal items, shoes and bags with cleansing or baby wipes before disposing of them in the usual way. I think, Brian, this is the biggest hole in the entire British government narrative here, which needs to be filled pretty quickly. Because if we go back to Hamish, he said the devastating Salisbury nerve agent. Dame Sally says baby wipes, as does Public Health England. And as we are going to follow this through, this seems to be the key narrative here. It is impossible to actually get to grips with whether this is a devastating, highly toxic nerve agent or whether it's something that really we don't need to worry about too much because we just need to wipe it off with baby wipes. When is this hole going to be filled and who's going to fill it?
Well, the hole should be filled, Mike, by the press and the media. I'll say the mainstream, with a smile on my face, press and media, asking these key questions. They're very simple questions, but they don't want to ask, how is it that we've got a deadly military-grade nerve agent that a woman is saying, simply use some of these. We've got a packet. These are baby wipes. We don't want to advertise the particular brand, but here they are. She's saying, don't worry about all that training that you did in the military, that you need suits, you need every piece of skin covered, you need a respirator, you need to be immensely careful with not only handling the substance, but victims of the substance. She says, no problem, just use some baby wipes. The position's untenable. Well, let's jump on to this one, and thank you very much to the person who sent us through the heads up. But apparently Swindon Fire Service tweeted out a little while ago that they'd attended an event, but the event was basically drug related. So this was the tweet. We'll just blow it up a little bit on screen. 77-mile round trip for our operational support unit last night to Amesbury. Thankfully, the incident wasn't serious and our decontamination shower wasn't required. And let me just see if I can read you the smaller print in here. We're having a few. There we are. Let's see. Inset, it's not very clear, but it says an incident in the King's Gate area of Amesbury on Saturday night, June the 30th, is thought to have been a drug-related medical episode. More than 10 emergency vehicles arrived on the scene from police, ambulance and fire service. A number of roads around the estate were closed for a time, but reopened within a couple of hours. So that tweet went out at 7:48 a.m. on the 1st of July 2018. And of course, many people picked up on the fact that it was talking about a drug-related episode. And then, mysteriously for some, that tweet was taken down from the fire service Twitter page. We called them this morning. I've got to say, we spoke to an absolutely charming lady who was very happy to talk about why they'd done what they'd done and to give me an explanation. I'll take you through the key points here. This is what they had to say. The Twitter page is run as a voluntary initiative by a fireman, and it was taken down because of the volume of responses. So he put up a tweet in good faith. What happened was they then had a barrage of public responses, which I'm going to interpret. They just saw this as a very difficult thing to handle. They'd simply said what they'd done. They weren't prepared to then get involved in a response with however many public contacted them, but it was a lot. So they decided the simplest thing was to take the tweet down. And they were very open in saying this. They said that Swindon Fire and Rescue were asked to attend by the ambulance service, and they did attend along with other emergency services, but were then stood down as not needed and returned to base. The lady said that the fire service attended based on the call and information they received at the time. So she's more or less saying, please don't prejudge us. We just attended on the information we had at that point in time. And lastly, she said, and I absolutely believe this report, the fire services reported their attendance accurately in the tweet and could not effectively anticipate the significant questioning in public responses. So That is the fire service response, but of course, if we look at their accurate report that they were called out to a drug-related incident and then stood down against the fact that nasty Novichok has reared its deadly head, there's a number of questions which the press and media should have been asking of the government and Public Health England. But of course, the problem is this muddle in Muggleton.
Well, before we move on to that, can I just ask, why would a fire service team that includes a shower for decontamination be called out to a drug-related incident?
Well, my take on this, Mike, would be that the ambulance service probably reacted in the same way. They got to an incident, they found 2 unconscious people, they would have already been briefed on the high alert in the area. So they took a sensible precaution. I'm going to defend them. I don't know, but the ambulance service says, blimey, we've got 2 unconscious people. We had 2 unconscious people before. We better get some proper backup. So they call the fire service respond accurately, but then on scene, somebody makes a decision that it's a drug-related incident, and eventually the stand down is given. And we know that Novichok wasn't diagnosed for another 2 days, if I've got my dates correct. And this is surprising after we've just done a whole national course in how to diagnose Novichok. I personally believe the ambulance service and the fire service are telling the truth. And if there's a mismatch in the story, that's because the story itself doesn't follow.
Right.
So there's the muddle. Let's come into this to show you some of the just appalling reporting. The Daily Mail, did the victims take poison home? Police scour places visited by a couple poisoned by Novichok amid fears they took the contaminated object back to their flat. Remember that object because it never really appears again. A tale of Daily Mail poisonous reports. This is unbelievably bad reporting. And they put together a very senior team to do it. So they had Chris Greenwood, senior crime reporter, Amin Simaz, Tom Payne here, and this lady, Georgia Edkins. So they needed a team of 4 to construct this story. Let's have a look. Detectives believe a couple fighting for their lives after finding a discarded nerve agent. Is that the object? A discarded nerve agent. What does that actually mean? It's not clear. Hundreds of officers are searching for a contaminated item left behind by the would-be killers targeting a Russian spy. What item? Police, I'll just highlight that one. Police are scouring the home of Dawn Sturgis, 44, and boyfriend Charles Rowley, 45, for the remains of the deadly Novichok used in the assassination plot. This makes it sound as though
is it decomposing in some way?
Well, the remains of it, or is this a sample of the actual batch? No, how do I describe this? The actual Novichok that was used, some of it was put on their door handle, was it apparently? And then the rest of that Novichok somehow found its way into these people's hands. They suspect the object could have been some kind of delivery device that was recklessly discarded after the attack. What delivery device?
Well, some speculation saying a syringe.
It's all speculation, Mike. The whole article is a web of speculation and half-truth and spin. There's nothing to support the delivery device. And then they later say that the contaminated item could be something as innocuous as a cigarette butt. So therefore it could be a pencil.
Yes.
It could be a paper bag.
Yes.
It could be anything.
It could be a baby wipe.
It could be a baby wipe. And then they go on. So far, nothing has been found, and police say they have no idea what the highly toxic nerve agent was contained in. Oh, okay. They now believe that the Rowley and Sturgis, a mother of 3, may have spotted something unusual on the ground and picked it up. Well, that limits things, doesn't it? They picked something up. Experts suspect the couple came across the item after it was thrown away in a haphazard way. I'm starting to laugh again because this is so bizarre. And this is the Daily Mail's best team. It's just incredible. So it goes on. One expert source says Novichok doesn't evaporate, it exists forever. Incineration is the most effective method, but they're not going to burn Salisbury down. This is like something out of a children's comic.
Right, let's just mention baby wipes again at this point.
It does, but it exists forever. That's what they said. So they then have an analysis embedded in the article. What are Novichoks? What do they do? And why do they tend to take so long to disappear? How are they cleaned? Getting rid of these nerve agents is surprisingly simple. Bleach can do the job, and water also breaks down the toxins. But it exists forever, Mike. Apart from the fact when you use water.
Does it not rain in Salisbury?
It rained 12 inches within 4 days after the attack.
So how can water break down the toxin, but the toxin has lasted for the last 4 months in some kind of object that they picked up off the ground, which has been rained on to the scale of 12 inches?
And how can this fantasy last forever? Because the whole thing is a pack of lies. Why do they take so long to disappear? Novichoks were engineered to be stable chemicals that do not evaporate or decompose quickly. Well, they're going to evaporate if you give them long enough, and we already know water can actually deal with them. That's why the military use vast quantities of water to decontaminate tanks and ships. So if this is analysis by the Mail, it's crass. Why are people being advised to wash their clothes? Water can break down Novichoks, but they last forever, Mike. But where do they come to use those baby wipes? And then we'll bring in this man, Philip Ingram. So we've got another expert. And what does he say? They could have thrown it under a hedge. They could have thrown it into a school playground. They could have put it under the seat in a local train. By not focusing on what the authorities have done, they've put the public at risk. What they used is what I class as the ostrich effect. Well, it's all too complicated, so we'll stick our heads in the sand and hope nothing happens. Unfortunately, something has happened. This man's talking gobbledygook, and the Mail is just reporting it without any form of analysis. Alex, I am beginning to wonder whether it's me, but I am reading this stuff. It's a mixture of spin, lies, half-truth, fantasy. It's impossible to pin this language down. Drugs?
If I'm permitted a second snobby public school in Oxbridge remark, there's one chap on the Daily Mail senior investigations team who's been sensible enough not to burn his fingers on this, even though his title is something like senior investigations reporter, and that's my old classmate Guy Adams, who was top scholar together with me at rugby in my class. And I'm not surprised he hasn't touched it with a barge pole, even though his title would probably be the best suited for sleuthing here. They've had to bring in people who can't write for toffee. And this is a bit ironic because I remember 10 years ago there was a big push at GCHQ to professionalise our until then very boring reporting style. And we had to bring in bullet points which were actually mirrored on the Daily Mail's use of 4 or 5 key points under the headline, and write more like the Daily Mail, like a mid-market tabloid come broadsheet was the advice given in a series of reporting initiatives. And yet the Daily Mail itself now is coming up with the misrelated participles and unspecified topics that we got black marks for 10 years ago at GCHQ. So the press reporting has actually collapsed.
I think that's a good way of putting it. If we've got a foreign country, allegedly Russia, dumping weapons-grade nerve agent into UK cities, and we've got this fantasy, this pantomime going around, the government has actually broken down. We have not got a government capable of running this country and protecting us. I think this is breakdown, and the press are demonstrating the scale of the breakdown.
Well, the question in my mind, Brian, has been why, and I'm just going to throw this as a speculative suggestion as to why this is happening and why it's happening now, and that is this: Trump and Putin are about to meet next week, and well, they don't want it to happen. Who doesn't want it to happen? Well, Theresa May's fat controllers don't want it to happen. I'll just remind everybody, of course, that a few weeks ago at the G7, she agreed with the other G7 leaders to establish a rapid response mechanism, which would allow the G7 to, as a group, assign blame for certain events, chemical weapons events, for example, biological weapons events. And of course, this was followed up with Boris Johnson heading off to the OPCW to campaign for attributing responsibility for an attack. He said that this was part of the OPCW's technical remit, and they eventually got the OPCW member states to vote in favour of this initiative for the ability to attribute responsibility. Now, I'm fascinated by the fact that the OPCW is absolutely silent on this latest Amesbury event. They haven't said a word about it. There's no sign of them being called in. There's no sign of them offering any statements on this. But Alex, what are your thoughts on the possibility that that the Trump-Putin meeting is the target for this?
It might sound a long shot to people who are not au fait with it, but the themes of press reporting are very much set editorially, and you and I and Brian all have our contacts in mainstream media who will kind of breathlessly tell us conspiratorially, well, we're interested in what UK column's talking about, but there's an editorial veto on it. These things do exist, and where do the editors go? They go off to Bilderberg, they go off to dining clubs like Mansion House and the other City of London ventures, they go off holidaying with the kind of people who set the financial agenda, and it's the financialists, the vipers, who are absolutely petrified of Trump starting a revised version of their own New World Order, one that brings more prosperity. While we're knocking the Daily Mail, I forgot to mention one from last week when the story broke. The couple in Amesbury was said by the captions editor to have been omitted to hospital. I think they omitted their judgment there.
Indeed. Right. Well, Theresa May and Angela Merkel were meeting yesterday. Aren't they looking very fetching there, smiling and giggling to each other? We believe that what was said was that you said Novichok. But anyway, Theresa May met Angela Merkel in Berlin. They were discussing UK's withdrawal from the European Union. They were discussing shared priorities for the upcoming NATO and Western Balkan summits. A Downing Street spokesperson said during the Prime Minister's meeting with Angela Merkel, the two leaders held productive and positive talks on a range of topics. The EU, of course, as I've said, but it included the latest situation in Amesbury. The two also discussed the upcoming NATO summit, where the Prime Minister said that it was vital for all countries to display solidarity and unity. So that's fantastic. Well, let's, in the run-up to that, Nigel Farage has come out of the woodwork criticising the EU for its EU military union moves, and also with regard to the NATO summit. So this is obviously ex-UKIP leader Nigel Farage saying to the EU that you appear to be hell-bent on pushing for your European army, hell-bent for a foreign policy without a veto. I can agree with him up to this point. But he goes on to say, and hell-bent to be on a direct collision course with President Trump and with NATO. Well, I'm sorry, but this is simply untrue. He went on to say that you can't have a European army and NATO existing side by side. And maybe your next big challenge to Europe is European citizens will need to work out who do they best feel protected by, the European army or America and NATO. Well, I'm sorry, but this is just complete nonsense. We have made the point many times over the last 18 months or 2 years that NATO has absolutely been in on the discussions with regard to the establishment of EU military unification. Federica Mogherini, the EU's or the European Commission's High Representative, and Jens Stoltenberg, absolutely lockstep with regard to this. And so any suggestion that NATO is not on board with EU military unification is obfuscation at best, and significantly worse, I believe. But anyway, Edward Lucas then today has followed up on his hysteria last week by pushing a report on the BBC, and you can see the style of it here. It's a big budget report on the BBC with regard to Trump and NATO. Because, of course, they're all really concerned about Trump's, as I said a second ago, Trump's meeting with Putin. They're concerned about Trump threatening to withdraw troops out of the European Union. Alex, the bottom line here is that the reason that Trump is making these threats is these are follow-up threats to the threats he made last year at the NATO summit when they inaugurated the new NATO HQ. He is absolutely determined that European countries should put more money into defence, and so his threats to withdraw US troops from Europe are to do with that, to do with getting the European Union to contribute more to defence. And I don't see any evidence whatsoever that Trump actually is in any way negative to the idea of EU military unification.
No, Mike, he isn't, because to a large extent he still takes his cues from Wall Street and the City of London, albeit in a different form. And it's always been the Anglo-American financial and the Swiss financial model to get EU military union. And even with the best will in the world, if you're a US president, one who's come from sideways and not from politics, you only have a very vague idea of Europe. I'm not belittling his intelligence. He knows very well the specifics of Britain and even of Scotland. But Americans do tend to see, for pragmatic purposes, as Kissinger said, Europe as a single place for military and security purposes, and they do want a single pair of hands to take care of it, at least a single phone number to call. It's a question of financial rationalization. What makes Trump and Putin's governments different from that of Britain and Western Europe, I think, is that they're predictable. They actually say what they're going to say to do and stick to it. This is why they get so much detraction from the Anglo-French press, shall we say, where random government, a kind of anarchy, is the order of the day. Keeping the government, keeping the people guessing, keeping them on their toes. Both Trump and Putin have said in their geopolitical campaign structures and their platforms beforehand exactly what they're going to do, what they expect of countries. He wrote to Norway's Prime Minister, President Trump did, with this letter. The only reason that's been published is because the Norwegian press has a habit of doing that, just as when Prime Minister Edward Heath here in Britain wrote to the Norwegian Prime Minister in 1972 and said, please help me stitch up the fishing deal for entry into the EEC, as it then was. These letters were sent to other prime ministers, but it's only the Oslo press that brought it out. So, we get a little glimpse behind the scenes, but the key issue, I think, is that President Trump is communicating to all European leaders what he expects, and indeed he is probably expecting some degree of burden sharing.
Can I just add a bit to that, and I'll cover it next week, but astonished that somebody sent me a BBC report which was all about the use of tarot cards and black magic spells to try and bring Trump down. This was quite a major article from the BBC, and what section did they have it in? Their business section. So I'm not sure what the BBC is playing at the moment. Well, I think I do, but just an astonishing report from the BBC.
Okay, sticking with defence then, we've been talking about what's been going on with Rolls-Royce over the last few weeks, and of course they've been cutting jobs, and particularly management jobs, so looking like a restructuring situation going on. Well, here we've got more restructuring. Rolls-Royce Holdings has said that it's going to sell its commercial marine business to Norway's Kongsberg Gruppen, ASA, for £500 million. Brian, Alex, this looks increasingly like Rolls-Royce getting itself organised towards some kind of acquisition. Alex, you've got your hand up there. What are your thoughts on this?
Heretofore, thanks to David Ellis, we have known that China wants its mitts on Rolls-Royce's small engineering, particularly the compact engines. What the Norwegian arm of Rolls-Royce has done has been to produce the big marine engines, which go back to post-Second World War models, very high-powered, reliable engines suitable for warships. Very interesting that these are being sold to Kongsberg, because the Norwegian Kongsberg Group is just going into partnership with German conglomerates. If my memory doesn't fail, I think it's Rheinmetall, but certainly a major German conglomerate is actually teaming up with Kongsberg for marine and aviation engineering. And these engines with minor variations can be fitted into bombers just as easily as into warships. So it looks very much like the German core of EU military union wanting Rolls-Royce technology again, so confirming David Ellis's plans. And to complete the conspiratorial aspect, this is often being done with Boeing's connivance. The pieces are shuffled so as to remove the European competition to Boeing's hegemony.
But what we're seeing here is continuing consolidation in the European defence industry.
Very much so. With bearing in mind what we reported yesterday and the whole trajectory of this, we're going to end up with a situation ere long where there is a single transcontinental blob, which isn't even European within Europe. It's going to have as much American elements to it as it has European. It's going to be the global arms cartel blob brackets Europe, producing arms for a European supranational military structure.
Yeah. Okay, thanks for that, Alex. Yesterday, the vote on the digital single market, this was copyright directive, took place in the European Parliament. 27 votes in total. 318 voted against it. So this was the copyright directive, which was going to bring in the potential link tax, so-called link tax, and also the requirement to have some kind of content ID mechanism for uploads to the internet. Now, what happens now is this is not the end of the story. This goes back to the drawing board. I mean, basically, the criticism on this wasn't the ideas behind it as such, but merely the implementation of it, in the sense that the language that was used in the directive was too broad. There was criticism that it lacked understanding of how the internet worked. So that goes back to the drawing board, and then we'll go back for another vote in September, mid-September. So this is not over yet, and I suggest that anybody that's interested in that particular issue needs to keep active on it, because it won't go away.
And it's so dangerous.
Absolutely, yes. Now, Alex, let's go to Scotland briefly. ScotGov argues that prisoners will be prisoners.
This shocker was actually brought to my attention by Kenneth Roy, writing in the Scottish Review, which is the closest thing Scotland has to a mainstream dissident title, not completely in hock to the Edinburgh government. And if we go to the source of it here in Scottish legal news, we see that the Lord President, the equivalent in Scotland of the Lord Chief Justice in England and Wales, Lord Carloway, has actually expressed his disgust with the Scottish government in the strongest possible terms. What happened was a Polish gentleman called Daniel Kaiser, nearly a decade ago, because this has had to work its way through all the appeal courts, he was attacked with a steel bar in the prison gym by an Aberdonian prisoner who had previously said, "I'm going to smash your effing Polish face in, you Polish expletive." And then he was taken to Glasgow to be tried for an assault outside prison on another Pole. And as soon as he was convicted for that, he was sent back to serve out his custodial sentence in the Aberdeen prison. The next morning, he went to the gym and smashed the Polish man's face in. The Scottish government's argument, as this went through to appeal, which was astonishing enough that they didn't accept responsibility, the lawyers arguing for the Edinburgh government said on appeal, well, actually, even if we had told the prison guards that this man hated Poles and wanted to bash their faces in, it wouldn't have made a difference to how we'd have treated it, because prisoners utter violent threats all the time, and we don't really take those seriously or act upon them. So an utter failure of duty of care of prisoners in Scotland. One shudders to think this could have happened to Robert Greene, because, of course, there was racism, anti-English racism against Robert Greene, but that was from the judiciary and wasn't in the transcript. Robert Greene himself told about this on the channel recently. But, you know, Aberdonian prisons, Glasgow prisons, Scottish prisons in general, very violent places, and the Scottish government talks the talk but doesn't walk the walk in protecting prisoners in this situation. So, you know, British prisons are not what they were, particularly not Scottish prisoners, and it has to do with the political dichotomy now between lots of rhetoric about bullying and the reality where governors just have the attitude that prisoners will just care for themselves. So Lord Carloway was astonished and wrote that on this slide here, I think, we cannot accept this unattractive proposition. In summing up ScotGov's position, he said that the government's position, because they're the defenders in this case, was that notwithstanding the fact that a prisoner in their custody was exposed to the risk of injury as a result of the failure to report a threat of serious violence with racist overtones, nothing effective, argued ScotGov, would have been done about this by the prison authorities, and thus the attack would have happened in any event. One shudders to think, because any of us can end up in prison these days, and any of us could be exposed to this kind of attack.
Okay, let's come back to England then, and well, this party for Britain attempted to attend hustings recently at a by-election, and apparently was not able to. In fact, the entire by-election was shut down. Is that right? Or the entire hustings rather was shut down.
The hustings was shut down, and what's at contention here is the circumstances and decisions involved in deciding to shut it down. The deputy leader of For Britain, not a party I have a great deal of sympathy with, and I think most of our viewers don't either, some perhaps, has written to Cressida Dick, the notorious common purpose commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, of course, a key culprit in the Jean-Charles de Menezes shootings of the 21st of July 2007. And what he writes to Mrs. Dick, or Ms. Dick, I suppose we have to say, is that despite the party's security team clearly informing the local police of the event the day prior, And despite widely publicised threat of a substantial demonstration against us, your colleagues, that will be the Lewisham branch of the Metropolitan Police, manifestly failed to ensure our ability to safely attend the event. He describes a large baying and aggressive crowd gathering outside the venue. And he says, we made your colleagues, that's the Lewisham local cops, that we were en route. We do not think it a coincidence that shortly before we arrived at the venue, keywords here, the police shut the event down and instructed us not to attend. That is the claim of the For Britain party in the matter. A formal complaint is going in. Now, to some extent, this is corroborated from both left and right. So from the Antifa-style left-wing extremists, we have a gloating claim that they, the anti-racists, as they call themselves, stopped Anne-Marie Waters. And in reporting that, they actually talk about forming a human barrier where Anne-Marie Waters had been due to speak, and confronting the thugs of the right, and so on. And these thugs, so-called, left after being confronted by local anti-racists who humiliated the little Hitlers. Well, that's not just left-wing rhetoric. Here at Politics Home on the right, we have a report on it, which describes, and you have a picture there of the police forming up to expel troublemakers from the area. What they're saying here is that candidates who made it inside, i.e. there was a blockage of some people, including Waters, getting near it, she's the local candidate, they managed to make their opening remarks before officers asked the event organizer, John Hamilton, to close the debate down. So this is the key spin, I think, involved. The police asked, we know how police ask people things these days, they asked the hustings organizer to close the event down. So the constitutional question is, who closed this down, and was this the first time in British history that an election hustings was intimidated or cancelled, or was it a decision by the organizer himself? If the latter, which is the police spin, then of course no constitutional breach has occurred, but I don't believe it. On the next slide, we see people in their own words talking to Politics Home. Mr. Hamilton himself says it was a triumph for mob rule. The Liberal Democrat candidate says that the toxic and threatening atmosphere outside the hustings was totally inappropriate. And the Met's own spokesman talks about the permission of the event organizer, but it's with the permission of the event organizer. So the decision is clearly the police decision. And in passing, I also note that, as you mentioned recently, Mike, there's confirmation here that there is such a thing as de-arresting people where there's supposed breaches of the peace or public order offences. A murky scenario, and I'm not an advocate of Anne-Marie Waters' tactics, but I have to say that this is a decision taken by perhaps the worst borough of the worst police force in the country. If we just cast our minds back a few months, there was a house burglary where a notorious criminal family, a clan really, was given police protection to hold an elaborate, taunting funeral passing right in front of the house where the victim had died. So it's, or been confronted at least. I don't recall whether he died. I think there was a death involved. I don't know what you two have to say about these events.
Well, I think they're symptomatic of where the country is going. More and more reports we see on a daily basis are showing that we are not in a democracy. We are on a knife edge, really, to a dictatorship. Communitarian, we could discuss what sort of dictatorship, but we're seeing very dangerous situation. And as we keep pointing out, if there is violence on the streets, if that violence happens, then it gives the government opportunity to bring in curfews and bring in a full shutdown. Very dangerous times, I think.
Alex, from my point of view, I'm also not a fan of For Britain, but they are a political party which is accepted and regulated by the Electoral Commission, and whether or not I like their views is irrelevant. When Brian stood for election to a seat in Plymouth in 2010, he was refused an opportunity to speak at the hustings on the stage with the other mainstream parties. He was given some time to speak, a couple of minutes to speak from the floor, and got quite an ovation, a standing ovation, as it were, at the time. So, you know, at what point do we decide that what somebody is saying is unacceptable? Surely, if we are a democratic society and somebody is accredited party by the Electoral Commission, so they're not a prescribed organisation, then they have to have a right to speak. Otherwise, we do not have free and open elections. And it doesn't matter to me that I don't agree with their point of view, that my opportunity to question them surely is my right.
The key thing I think that's gone wrong, Mike, is that since about the 1950s, people have allowed private venues masquerading as public spaces to host these hustings. Often these are Church of England venues. I recall when Craig Murray, the former diplomat to Uzbekistan, wished to stand against Jack Straw, who was then the foreign secretary and his former boss, in his constituency of Burnley. The local Anglican cathedral, I think it is in Burnley, certainly a major church, actually held a hustings, and there's BBC footage, no less, of the verger or warden of that cathedral ushering Murray out and saying only the mainstream candidates are allowed a space. If the C of E in particular, and it's happened down your way in Exeter as well with Brian watching the goings on, if the C of E wants to play a public service and host hustings, it must host every registered candidate. Otherwise, it is playing a political game. So we really perhaps have to go back to public spaces.
With an eye on the clock, Alex, I'll just say the particular church that was holding the hustings was the Methodist Church in Plymouth. And I only got in by saying, well, clearly this is not a Christian church because you're not giving people the right to speak. And eventually they backed down. But as Mike's just said, I wasn't allowed to join the other candidates on the platform. I had to speak from the floor. I was standing at that time as an anti-corruption independent. And I'll just add that when the BBC Devon, Radio Devon, I think it was, came to interview me, they calmly told me that they wanted to interview me, but they only had 6 seconds of allocated time to do that.
Right, Alex, a secret common purpose in the mainstream media.
This is at One Angry Gamer. Now, since Gamergate of a few years ago, which might have passed the older people among us by, there has been a trend that those who play online computer games are some of the most intelligent and questioning reporters of what's going on in the shaping of public discourse. And in this particular case, One Angry Gamer has a piece headlined "Left-Wing Media Cabal Outed," features 400 members from journalism and academia. And without getting down and dirty about it, it relates to a set of trend-setting, mostly US East Coast-based writing outlets. These are kind of para-journalism. Instead of going to mainstream news, a lot of the millennials, especially the trendier and young women, go to sites like Jezebel.com or The Atlantic to get their themes, how we should think about social issues. And what's been turned up here by the gaming journalists, who are a very politicized community now, very aware, is that all these writers in the, should we say, Greater New York have a secret forum in which they not only say, shall we discuss transsexualism in this case, but go into detail. There's screen posts in the article on how to cover transsexualism. Where should we be taking the public? What views in specific detail should we be presenting the public as to what transsexualism is? So I think it blows out of the water the idea that journalism, such as it exists these days in London or Washington or New York, is apolitical. Journalism consists now of clans, of tribes that take their leads by basically the online equivalent of smoky room pub discussions.
But what you seem to be indicating is a cartel, as it were. Aside from the brands that they happen to work for, there's a cartel of running some kind of agenda. Where's the competition between titles under these circumstances?
There is none. You only have establishment media in its myriad forms and dissident media. And we at UK Column, who don't take a particularly strong right or left-wing stance, have more in common because we're truth seekers with, well, shall I name a few titles? The Canary, which is very much a Corbyn supporting title, or some of the more racialized right-wing titles. We have more in common together on our platforms than we do with any of the mainstream titles, whichever political party they support, because the latter all have these journalists. Okay, in Britain it's a bit more suave than it is in America, the way it's done, but they're all taking leads from each other.
Okay, Alex, I'll just come in on the back of that and say that we've been pointing people at policy for some time when things happen, particularly when people are disturbed by what they're seeing happening and what they're experiencing. Where does the policy come from? Who were the individuals who made that policy? And this was highlighted to me a couple of days ago. We've got the Daily Mail here again. Stephen Glover, if the Tories think pushing transgender rights will win the next election, they're deluded. And I've picked out a sentence underneath. He's asking, is this classic displacement activity? In part, certainly. In political terms, it's the equivalent of fussing over the menu in the House of Commons while the whole Palace of Westminster goes up in flames. Encourage people to read this article because there's some very good stuff in it. But I get the impression that Stephen Glover really doesn't know what he's looking for. But let's come into this from the angle of where does the policy, in this case transgender, come from? Well, this is Theresa May. So she was quoted, "The government will ease the path for those who want to switch sex. I want to see a process that's more streamlined and demedicalised. They should not have to go through an invasive medical process. I also promise to ban conversion therapy, which is supposedly being used to persuade people to stop being gay." So we've got a Novichok attack on the soil of UK. We've got the NHS falling apart, but Theresa May is concentrating on transgender. I say why. Penny Mordaunt comes in on this article as well. Penny Mordaunt was also playing to the gallery when she inveighed against conversion therapy on BBC Radio's Fours Today programme on Tuesday morning. Presumably she hoped that her undertaking to ban this form of treatment, which seeks to persuade people to repudiate their innate sexual inclinations, would endear her to the LGBT community. And Glover goes on because he then pulls this man into the fray. So this is Tunde Ongun Bizan, Director of Diversity at the BBC, who recently boasted exultantly that the corporation has over 400 transgender staff, which represents more than 1 in 50 of the workforce, about 4 times higher than the proportion in the general population. And there's a little bit more here. Tunde, of course, wishes there were many more of them. He believes the BBC is not diverse enough, and in particular averred that more lesbians are needed there. So N. Glover comes in with this: surely the concept of self-identification is near madness. I cannot for the life of me understand why a hard-headed government facing grievous difficulties should be wasting its time flirting with such lunatic ideas. But of course, these are not lunatic ideas. They've come in policy. Where have those policies come from? Well, we can jump to The Guardian. UK lobbies for trans rights in the UN treaty, but allows the term pregnant women. That's because they wanted to get rid of the term pregnant women and you could just be a pregnant person or pregnant people. And who's in this article? We're talking 2017 here. The government will ease the path for those who want to switch sex. I want to see a process that's more streamlined and demedicalised. So that first one was from the Mail. This is the bit that she then says in The Guardian a year earlier. Last week, Theresa May pledged to press ahead with plans to let people officially change gender without medical checks. Speaking at the Pink News Awards dinner, May said she was committed to improving trans rights. We're determined to eradicate homophobia, transphobic bullying. We've laid out plans to reform the Gender Recognition Act, streamlining and demedicalising the process for changing gender, because being trans is not an illness and it should not be treated as such. So a year earlier, we can see that actually Theresa May and the whole of the UK government were attempting to use the UN in order to force this policy through. So follow the policy, follow the people creating the policy, and we start to see where this agenda, which Glover calls lunatic, I prefer to say immensely dangerous, is coming from.
Would you want some comment from Alex?
Well, Alex has got a topic here on giggles, but I think he'll probably want to go to Hofstra.
Yes, I think we should actually do that because we are absolutely out of time. So, Alex, you want just to remind us again about Hofstra, yes?
This is just a quick reminder from yesterday that Barbara Hofstra is continuing to be held by York Social Services. The address to write to her is there. She has a particular request now that she's banned from seeing people taken by the social workers, so-called in her best interests, that she should at least receive comforting letters and encouraging letters. One update since yesterday on Peter Hofstra's side. He's in mental incarceration in Austria. is that he's been banned from using the fax. This comes after he saw through the glass front of the office on his closed ward Dr. Meyer, the ward doctor, rifling through his faxes, which of course is a contravention of the telecommunications laws. It would be in any European country. And he confronted Dr. Meyer on this. He continues to receive only sporadic access to the arthritis medicines that he's supposed to be given every day. And so his legal and communication and medical requirements are all being openly flouted now by the LKH hospital in Graz, the Sigmund Freud Clinic. Fortunately, there's some local people on the case trying to assist, and his own appeal against the mental incarceration is awaiting judgment.
Okay, Alex, thank you for that. And we'll also remind people that Melanie Shaw is due to appear in Leeds Crown Court on the 10th. That's Tuesday. She's being charged with arson and sexual assault. And I'll add that if you're in the local area and can attend, it's possible Melanie won't attend court, but it would be so valuable for any members of the public to be able to enter court, to listen to what's being said and to understand what's being planned for Melanie. So if anybody can attend that court hearing, that would be really excellent. Please be polite, measured, well-behaved, as always, for Melanie's sake, apart from anything else. But we'd be very grateful of any feedback from that hearing. That's it for today. Alex, thank you very much for joining us. We'll leave people to think about the mixed muggle of Novichok.
Yes.
Thanks for joining us. Bye-bye.
Bye.